Hi, I'm Dr. Syra. I wanted to talk to you today about something to do with gardening, but not really, but kind of. Okay. So, for those who have been following along my journey in the last couple of years, you might recall that I'm really into plants suddenly. This is very not like me. It is not something I was ever interested in my entire life. I would kill plants. I would get angry when people gave me plants because I'm like, how am I going to keep this thing alive? But over the last couple of years, that's changed. And I started with um, doing a little bit of experimentation in this little plot of land that I call my wild garden. It's very small, and I planted some tulip bulbs in there after my stepdad died, kind of in honor of him. And I planted them in September. Like I set up the soil and I planted them, and then they came up in the spring, and it was like a big thing. And so every year for the last 4 years, I've been kind of adding to that garden, and then I noticed over the winter I was feeling sad because I couldn't get my hands in the dirt. And so then I started doing house plants. So it's like a whole thing. So the last 4 years have been this foray into gardening and house plants and garden plants and inside, outside, all the things with the dirt and all that. And it's been incredibly eye-opening for me because there's so many incredible metaphors in the garden. And so that's actually something I wanted to share with you today is a metaphor that I experienced last weekend. So I bought these hydrangeas. And so if you don't know what a hydrangea is, it's a green leafy plant that has like the flower heads are like this big because they're like a bunch of tiny little flowers, and then it looks like these big giant things. And a lot of people plant hydrangeas in their gardens, and then they grow to these big beautiful bushes, and then they have all these flowers, and they turn color depending on the soil acidity. They also, some hydrangeas will actually change color, like the flower will go from like a purple to a blue to a thing, and it's like a whole like evolving thing. But I bought hydrangeas in a pot because I felt like I did a lot of research, and it felt like I wasn't ready to do the in the ground, and I didn't have a spot for them in my garden because remember it's like this big, so I didn't have spots. I was like, okay, I'll get them in the pots. And so the first year I bought the hydrangeas, and they're like about, I guess the pot is about like this big, and the flowers were beautiful, and they were kind of already blooming, and it was great. And I put them outside in my front area in their pots, and they were so happy. And then the winter came, and I was like, oh, what do you do with hydrangea? So I looked it up, figured out that you can actually overwinter the pots. And so what happens to hydrangeas in the winter is that all of the leaves, all the flowers fall off, all the leaves fall off, and all that's left is these like sticks. And it looks like the plant is completely dead. It's just these like dead sticks coming out of the ground or out of the pot. So I took that dead stick pot, and I put it in what I call my winter nursery, which is basically like a covered space inside. That's kind of cool. And then I forgot about them all winter. I just kind of left them there. Every so often, I don't know if this is what actually gardeners do, but I took some snow from outside and I like put it in the pots because I'm like, that's what would happen if they were outside. So maybe I don't know where I learned that. I think I just made that up. So I take some snow, like twice a month. I take some snow, put it in the pots, making it all up, right? My neighbor says gardening is like an experiment. So I'm like, I'm going to experiment. So I'd put the little bit of snow in the pot. It would slowly melt. And then in the spring, these buds started coming up. And I was like so happy. I was like, oh my gosh, they're alive. And these little green buds started coming up. And then, it got warm enough to bring them outside. So I brought them outside. And then, so this is kind of their second season. Now, this summer, the hydrangeas looked quite different than they did when I first got them. They were kind of like spindly. They weren't that happy. The blooms weren't as robust. I could tell that these plants were not happy in these pots. And so I had a decision to make. I had three choices. Either I could just keep it in the pot and do the same thing, take them in the winter, and then bring them back out the next year. I could do that. I could throw them away, right? Like just put them in the compost and say, well, they're not really thriving, so I'll put them away. Or I could put them in the ground. And so I decided to put them in the ground. And this is where the metaphor that I wanted to share with you today, because it's been really in my awareness since I put those hydrangeas in the ground. So what I had to do to get those in the ground is I had to dig a big hole. And digging holes is harder than it looks on all those like movies that you watch where people like bury bodies and stuff. Yeah, it's not like that. It's hard work. And so it was like digging a hole, and then you have to kind of put the plant in and you have to have the right soil around it. And there's a whole thing. But what's interesting is that for the first couple of days after you move a potted plant into the ground, it kind of wilts a little bit, right? It's kind of a bit unhappy sometimes. And that makes sense, right? Because the whole thing has been shocked, like it's been taken out of its environment, been put into a new environment. And it's like, whoa, what do we do? And it kind of like goes limp. But in a couple of days, it starts to like grow. It starts to kind of come back to life. Now, I've been thinking about this in the context of my experience with the shifting of Dragonfly Wellness and the closing of the center, like the kind of the one-to-one deep intensive work, and moving into more group work and teaching, and this transition that's happening. So I've been thinking of that. This container that I've had of Dragonfly Wellness Center was like a pot, and it was safe. And for a few seasons, things thrived in that pot. But we're at a season now where that pot isn't, it's not the right environment anymore for this beautiful plant. And for the plant to grow into its best self, it needs to be removed from the pot and planted into the ground. Now, what's really interesting when you plant one of those, a little plant like that into the ground, the first thing it does is it starts to stretch out its root system. And I wonder what that's like for the plant, right? Because it's stretching out and it's like not hitting anything, right? When a plant is stretching out in a pot, it hits the edges of the pot. But when it's in the ground, it's actually like it can go beyond that, and it can actually stretch and get really strong and grounded and rooted in the garden. And in the garden, there's other plants. And so now my hydrangeas, I visualize them like those roots are going and they're connecting to the roots of trees and other plants and bushes. There's worms in the dirt. There's other things in the dirt that create this like incredibly nutritious, rich environment. But for that plant that's used to being in the pot, it can be a bit much. It can be a lot. It can feel like you've kind of lost your footing. It can feel like you've lost your container, because you actually have. And I just wanted to put this out for all of the people out there who may be going through a transplant, who may be going through shifting from one way of being in the world to this other way of being in the world that's probably better for you in the long run, and you know that, but it's also different. It's also so much space to grow in any direction, and the guidelines and the rules aren't as clear about how you're going to look or what this is going to turn into. And so there's an excitement about that, because like I'm thinking, well, these hydrangea bushes, like they could get huge, right? They could also not survive the winter. That's a possibility, right? It could be that springtime comes and the root system hasn't developed enough, and the hydrangeas actually don't succeed, and they fail. So we take that risk, right? When we move from something known and concrete and certain to something that's a bit more nebulous and a bit more open, there's a risk that it might not work. And that's part of this step that we're taking with shifting things, is we just don't know how it's going to go. The roots are starting to stretch out. There's nothing hitting the edges. It's like whole new territory. So I wanted to share this idea with you, to help you understand what kind of was happening here at Dragonfly, but also what may be happening for you as you move your understanding of yourself and your understanding of the world beyond the pot that you came in, right? So beyond your family beliefs, beyond your cultural beliefs, beyond what people think is acceptable and normal, into this other space where you might really be thriving. But there may be a couple of days, there may be a period of time where you feel a bit wilty and you feel a bit like you have no energy and you're not sure what you're doing. And that is so normal. When we do a big life change like this, it makes sense that there's going to be a transition time and an adjustment time. So those are my thoughts about the garden, and the benefits of actually making that call to transplant yourself out of the safety of your pot into the garden where things are really limitless. The other thing about being in the garden that I'm really excited for my hydrangeas is that now they get to tap in, like I said, to that underground web of communication that happens, the mycelium network that happens. And I actually haven't planted them in my little garden. I planted them in another spot, which is more like a wild forest that's right beside my house. And so they're in the forest. Um, and so I'm really excited to see, how they start making friends with the other plant life that's there with them, and plants they've never encountered before, right? Organisms they've never encountered before. And I'm hoping that they're strong enough to thrive, to survive and thrive through that. And maybe they won't be. And that's okay too. I was saying to my neighbor, if all goes wrong, it was an experiment. And a failed experiment. Sometimes that's how we learn the best. So those are my thoughts about change and how to manage when you just don't know exactly what this new thing is going to look like, but trusting that there's some intelligence in us that's always moving towards our highest and best iteration, with the choices that we make. So those are my thoughts. I hope that was helpful, and I would love to hear your transplant hydrangea stories if you have any, or other plants, or whatever you want to share about change in your life and how you've navigated going from a pot into the garden. Talk to you next time. Bye.